Good evening, this is John Milburn for Laws 11046, Law and the Environment. Well, we finally reached week 12 and we have a couple of people on the line. If you have any questions, please ask. Now, in terms of the examination, a couple of things that we need to consider. I have already provided some quite detailed outlines in Moodle and also some notes in UCrew, so please consider that. If you need to access your exam schedule, I think it was Madonna who kindly put up a way of doing that. You go into the My CQU tab and then into CQU Central, Student Centre, and you'll find a link to the exam. Now for 11046 this year, I believe that it is Friday the 17th of June at 2 p.m. It's a 3-hour open book exam, and please correct me if I'm wrong in that regard. On the front page of Moodle, I'll leave now the exam format guide. You'll see that it's in 2 parts. Part A, single question, compulsory, and Part B, where you get to choose a number of questions from 3 questions, I think, from 5. So in terms of Part A, it's a problem-solving issue, and you'll see that you're required to answer it from the perspective of a potential client. Now, that might be an applicant in relation to a merits appeal. It might be in relation to an alleged failure to comply with conditions. It might, in other words, to do with enforcement orders, or it might be to do with compliance with environmental law generally. Generally, it might be a prosecution type matter. So, and you might be looking at it from the applicant or the respondent, the plaintiff or the defendant, the prosecutor or the defendant, as the case may be. But if, when you read the question, you feel that you're a bit lost, just remember, try and go back to basics. It's always a good idea. And if you can structure the exam question by identifying the issues, stating the rules, then applying the rules to the particular factual circumstances, then ultimately a conclusion, that's the old IRAC method, then that's probably a good way of looking at it. Remember, of course, there are no electronic devices allowed into the examination, so don't take your phone in. Best you leave that in the car or at home. Now, in terms of examination guide, generally speaking, I've provided some information from the Great Guide to University Study. You'll find that, I think, in Moodle or the library, but I've extracted some material and I've put that in UCrew. Have a read of that and it will give you a good idea of how to establish some basics for studying for the exam and then writing the answer. And it covers some of the areas that I've covered already in terms of writing an introduction, a body and a conclusion. Remember, of course, that it's very easy to write very long-winded answers. You probably know well and truly by now that I don't favour long sentences. And the reason I don't is that, generally speaking, shorter sentences are easy for the reader to read. And given that I'm the reader, I'd like to read the material as easily and comfortably as possible. What we don't do these days, particularly in law, is write lengthy, convoluted sentences and paragraphs so that we give the appearance of being very clever and intelligent. What we try to do is make everything simple to understand if we can. Obviously, some of the concepts are difficult, we understand that, but do try to simplify your writing as much as you can. Be careful, however, to ensure that you are prepared to expand if need be. So if you find that you're well under word limits, for example, then my tip would be still using the idea of short sentences and concise logic, go into a few tangents that you think might be relevant to the question, and that way you'll pick up a few extra marks. If you get to a question and you really don't have much idea of it, I'd urge you to at least put something down. As I think I've mentioned a few times now, the first 50% is far easier to get than the second 50%. The hardest marks to get are those that are between 85 and 100%. So if you at least get something down, you give yourself a chance. In terms of preparing for the exam, please try to enjoy the process. I know that sounds easy for me to say. I'm on the other end of it. Although you'd be surprised to know I still study, I still try to learn. And it's part of it is it's growing and it's enjoyable. So do enjoy that process. Try not to be scared of the process. Now, of course, it's an open book exam. You can take in whatever you like, provided you can't access the internet, and a few other rules like bringing in dictionaries, I think. So I better not be vague. I better tell you exactly what it is now that I've raised it. What you can't take in is something to access the internet, a standard dictionary and a calculator. Well, you won't need the standard dictionary and you won't need the calculator. So pretty much everything other than connecting to the internet. So if you think you know what the question might be, you can write your answer. Take your answer in and just rewrite it in the exam. How stress-free would that make it? In the second part, it's primarily, if not exclusively, essay-style questions. So it'll be an easy sort of conceptual idea. It might be, for example, this is purely an example to give you an idea of the context. Certainly not going to be in the exam, but Australia is the lucky country. Critically analyse this statement. So if you get something like that, as part of your answer, you should at least discuss that statement from the perspective of Indigenous Australians, discuss it from the perspective of immigrants to Australia, discuss the statement from the perspective of asylum seekers, for example. So when you have a broad question, the first thought must be to think widely and then work towards bringing it back in. So don't immediately assume that I have a particular agenda to follow in asking a particular question. So, you know, if it's a question about vegetation management, for example, then look at that question from the perspective of different stakeholders is really the point that I'm trying to make. Now, in the exam itself, I do expect that you'll reference your external material. It's an open book exam. You'll have the material there. If you draw the material from an external source, please reference it. Plagiarism is not okay in an exam. So if you draw your material, please reference it. I'm not going to ask you to attempt footnote referencing in the handwritten exam. I appreciate that would just be too difficult. So some sort of Harvard-style referencing is fine. And by that I mean, if you're quoting from Bates, page, whatever it might be, 622, then you can just quote the material, put in brackets, Bates, page 622, close brackets. If you write Bates, I'll know exactly what you mean. So you don't have to provide the full reference. You won't have time to do that, and I don't need it. Also, I don't mind if you use shorthand if you're confident I'll know what you mean. In other words, this exam paper that you're writing is not for the general public, it's for me. So if you write EPBCA, I'll know that you mean the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, Commonwealth. That's fine. EPBC is fine. But you must reference your material is the point that I'm really trying to make. Okay, I would urge you to write some standard answers, and you can use those to adapt them in the examination, particularly in Part B. Now, Part A, you're going to have to look at this from the perspective of different stakeholders, as I mentioned before, and but that's still not to say you can't have standard answers written. You can. You can have that ready to go. All right, so there's information on Moodle, there's information on UCrew. I've provided some further information, hopefully that will assist you in your preparations this evening. To those of you who have submitted your work, thank you very much for doing so. For those of you who have not submitted all your work or maybe you haven't scored as well as you'd like, I urge you to continue and sit the exam and give it a go. And for everyone, can I just say thank you very much for your enthusiastic participation in this course. I would like you to have your say. I've got responses from quite a few people, but I'd like another 10 people to respond if I could. So please, if you haven't responded, please push the big red button and do that. It will be closing soon, so don't leave it too late. And that feedback is valuable to the university and it's also valuable to me, so I'd appreciate it greatly. It's all anonymous, so you can just say what you feel in relation to it. And that then essentially brings me to the end of the course. Unless there's any questions, there is one other thing, and that is every term I offer a typing test. I use Dragon voice recognition, so anybody wants to take me on. I've only been beaten once, but if it's silence, I'll assume there's no takers. All right, any questions? No? We're all good? Okay, well, I'll stop the recording. If there's any questions, please ask primarily through UCrew. If you really need to, send an email to me directly. But before you do, just think, is the response that I'm likely to give something that other students would be interested in? And if the answer is yes, then ask the question through UCrew. I think you all know that I monitor that pretty closely. And thank you very much for those that have embraced UCrew and used it. All the best, and good luck with the examination.